Hello, Potato! Welcome to the first installment of my Pixel Fire Geometry Nodes tutorial series. In this video, we're going to be creating a grid that we can use to spawn other objects with. Let's jump right in. We're going to use the default cube for this tutorial, so there is no need to delete it. Oh, for the love of... The first thing that we are going to do is enable the Node Wrangler add-on so we can wrangle our nodes. Go to Preferences, Add-ons, search for Node Wrangler and plop the box. Save and close. Next, open up a Geometry Nodes window. With the default cube selected, in the Geometry Nodes window, click on the New button. Awesome! Now we can get rid of the default cube, geometry node style. Hold Ctrl and right-click drag over the connection to cut it. Now, let's add that grid. Using Shift-A, we will search for the grid node. Connect the mesh output of the grid node to the mesh input of the output node. In the 3D viewport, we will see a plane. Wrong plane. If we go into wireframe view, we can see that the plane is a grid. We are going to use the vertices of this grid to spawn instances of the default cube. Now, we need a way for us to be able to control how many instances we are going to spawn in. We can easily control this on the grid node within the Geometry Nodes window, but we want to be able to control this in the Geometry Nodes modifier instead. We can use the existing group input node. Drag an empty socket from the group input node into the vertices X and another empty socket into the vertices Y. Now, to change the names of our inputs. Press N to reveal the Properties tab on the right of your window. We can now rename them under the Group tab under Input Sockets, which will appear on the Geometry Nodes modifier. You can call them whatever you like, but I'll be calling them X count and Y count. We also want to control the distance between each instance. If we adjust the X count and Y count values, the objects will get closer to each other and we will have to tweak the size X and size Y values every time. So, in order to make Geometry Nodes auto-magically calculate the distance between each point, we're going to do a bit of math. That's right, ladies and gentatoes, we're going to use some basic primary school mathematics. If we draw a grid here, creating one square with two x vertices and the distance being 1 meter between those vertices, we can safely assume that having two squares with 3 vertices will make it 2 meters wide, and 4 vertices will make it 3 meters wide, etc. So, we know that for every x amount of vertices, the distance will be x minus 1. So, let us add a math node and set it to subtract. Next, while holding Shift, right-click drag over the X count connection and Y count connection. This will create a reroute point on each of the connections where you dragged. Now, connect the reroute connection from the X count point into the top socket of the subtract node and set the bottom value to 1. Duplicate the node and do the same for the Y count from the reroute point. Plug the two nodes into the grid size X and size Y sockets. Next, we want to give each instance a bit of personal space using a value that we can input into the modifier. Duplicate the two math nodes and plug them in between the subtract nodes and the grid node. Set them both to multiply. Connect two empty sockets from the group input node into the open sockets of the multiply nodes. Rename the two input node sockets to X spacing and Y spacing. Let's check if it works. Awesome! We can leave the X and Y spacing at 2 for now. Next, we need to turn each of the vertices into a spawn point for our instances. Add a mesh to points node between the grid node and the group output node. This will convert the vertices of our group object into points in space where the instances can spawn on. All these nodes combined will now form the basis for us to spawn cubes in a grid pattern. Convert the nodes we have just created into a node group by selecting them and pressing Ctrl G. Press Tab to go out of the node group. Rename the node group to Steve or Point Grid, whatever floats your node. Node groups are an awesome way of keeping your nodes clean and can be saved for later use in other sections of your node army. It's kinda like creating your own custom node that does the things several nodes do when combined together. Finally, let's turn our default cube into an army of cubes. Add an instance on points node. This node uses the points that we have just created and spawns the geometry of a specific object or collection on each point. Plug that in between the point grid node group and the group output node. Since we already have the default cube geometry available, remember we only removed it by disconnecting the group input node and group output node, we will just use that. Just plug the geometry output socket from the group input node into the instance input socket of the mesh to points node. Boom! We have a cube army. We can now influence the cubes by adjusting the rotation and scale of the instance on points node. How cool is that? You can also tab into edit mode and edit the base cube, and all the instances will conform. Talk about group pressure. Don't forget to save this file somewhere where you can easily locate it for future use. For the purpose of this tutorial series, I will be saving it onto my desktop. In the next tutorial, we will be using this point grid along with other nodes to create a proximity node group. Press that like button if you enjoyed this tutorial, and don't be afraid to subscribe for more cool tutorial series like this in the future. Tjorts!